Mr. Keynote, shall we? Yeah. So I debated whether I should be introducing the keynotes, but I then decided to take the opportunity to say a few words. There are many ways one can introduce somebody. They can start talking about their own relationship with them, what they learned from them, what they learned defined them, which is the case with Nicolas Demertzis and me, because I was one of his students. And I think, for the most part, the reason that I decided to do a PhD and go to Stony Brook was after his suggestion and encouragement. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you a story about what he did. Not a story. It's just a little short anecdote. So the door opens, and it's a big auditorium in Athens, in Nomiki school. And this professor comes in, and he brings a pile of books. I know I've said this before. So he puts the books on the table, and he starts lecturing, and then he picks up a book and reads us an excerpt, and picks up another book and reads another excerpt. And everybody's wondering, how long is this going to go on? And there were probably like 8, 9 books in that lecture. So people started paying attention, not so much because of the content, but because of the mode of delivery. And this is the kind of speaker Nicolas is. What he tells us, what we learn from him, is not just his personal opinion. It's usually coming from deep reading, intensive study, exhausting attention to detail and resourcing of material. And maybe that's enough. I'm going to let you figure the rest of it, or experience the rest of it yourself. Nicolas Demertzis from the University of Athens and president of the EKE, which in Greek stands for the National Center for Social Research. Yes, thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, everyone, for being here to listen to what I have to say today. Again, thank you for inviting me to this seminar, and once more, thank you, Teresa, for what you said about me, very flattering things. With Teresa, we've been collaborating for many years, and I'm very glad and proud about that. At the same time, I would like to welcome you in my city, the city that I was born and raised in. And I think that some of you, or many among you, you will be surprised if I don't start with that self-congratulating Greek saying that Athens is the cradle of democracy. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to welcome you in the cradle of democracy. It's true, of course, that the Athenian democracy created a novel and sound model of citizenship that had no known predecessors. But the Athenian democracy is not the sole ancestor of modern democracies, because we do know that democratic assemblies were a reality around 2500 BC in areas of the Middle East, in areas that now are known as Middle East, and that institutions of self-government of equals existed in India as early as 1500 DC. So, putting aside Occidental preoccupations, one should be ready to admit that the direct democracy of the Athenians was a paradigmatic but not unique station in the long journey of democracy in history, and that its values and institutions are not written in stone. What I want to say at the outset of this presentation is that the history of democracy is still being made. It is a perpetually open-ended project punctuated by fragility and contingencies. This is captured by the title, of course, of your conference, Democracy as an Achievement which resists any sort of totalization, any sort of censure and closing up. Yet, the only intransigent kernel of democracy is the denaturalization of power, in the sense that it is a peaceful way to deal with who gets what, when, and how. Namely, it is a peaceful mediation of overt and covert societal conflicts. Beyond this kernel, there is a host of historical varieties, as well as a large number of theories, models, and methods addressing and assessing democracy, using variables such as the electoral process, the freedom of the press, and so on and so forth. This points to the fact that democracy is an essentially contested concept. We should take heed, however, that its contested character does not ultimately consist in an alleged conceptual overextension. Rather, it stems from its deep normative nature. The various criteria employed to define the concept of democracy, as much as analytic they are more normative than descriptive. The idea and the political praxis of democracy as a type of regime is premised on value and emotional basis. For the sake of the argument, today, in this lecture, I will treat modern democracy as a regime. By regime, I understand the set of relations between states and citizens, the demos, as well as a relationship between states and organized stakeholders and political actors. These relationships are contentious and are regulated through the rule of law, power holders' accountability, and public participation, and are, of course, mediated through political representation. This regulation is premised on free and equal participants entitled with basic human and social and political rights, which protect them from the state's arbitrary power. It is also premised on elections and mutually binding public deliberation. These arrangements are rooted in the intent to pursue a central aim, promoting human welfare and securing the widest possible breadth of citizenship rights and political participation among the population under its jurisdiction. From a psychologically informed political sociology of emotions perspective, in the rest of my talk, I hope over the next 35 minutes or so, I will be doing three things. First, I will refer to some salient top-down challenges that democracy is currently facing. Second, I will describe some enduring paradoxes of democracy which render it a particularly fragile regime. By doing so, I will be highlighting some of its emotional dimensions and undercurrents. Challenge number one, democracy in the wane. For a long time, a good number of political scholars and global institutional agents have repeatedly sounded the alarm about the existential crisis of liberal democracy, the decline of democracy, that democracy is in a state of emergency, if not undergoing a slow-motion death, that we live in an era of democratic anxiety, that a democratic deficit is spreading worldwide, that democracy requests reinvention, and that we are in need of a Marshall Plan for its recovery. These diagnoses are based on multiple and intersecting variables. For example, the Liberal Democracy Index invented by the VDEM consists of 5 components: the liberal component, the electoral democracy component, the participatory component index, the deliberative component, and the egalitarian component index. Surveying 195 countries and 15 territories, countries and states and non-states, so to say, for its 2022 report, the Freedom House estimated that almost 80% of the global population live in partly free or not free countries. In 2003, the percentage of free countries was 46%, whereas in 2021, it was 40%. We have a decline. To be sure, concerns about the quality of democracy or even the impossibility of democracy in the modern world are not a new phenomenon and are far from limited to the 19th or even the 20th century anarchist or hardcore Marxist attacks on bourgeois democracy, which was supposed to be a sham and as a non-accountable oligarchy dressed up to look like democracy. Mainstream theorists have also doubted democracy's prosperity. As a way of example, quotations, democracy has today entered a critical phase from which it will be extremely difficult to discover an exit, end of quotation. This statement was made by Robert Michels in 1915 in accordance to his own iron law of oligarchy. And of course, there were not only the elite theorists like Michels, Mosca, Pareto, who argued that democracy is highly impossible in the modern world. Writing about power elites in the middle of the 20th century, Wright Mills argued that political leaders are less responsive to the people or their representatives, and that they subvert democracy while pursuing their own interests or the interests of big business and armed forces. In this way, Mills claims liberal democracy ceases to be a genuine democracy or a democracy of publics and tends to become a community of masses driven by opinion makers and policy makers. And what is more, policymakers become largely independent of outside opinion, detached from the will of the people. For Mills, this is a deflection from the tenets of political liberalism and stands opposite to Schumpeter's notion of manufactured will. For Schumpeter, manufactured will is the inevitable outcome of modern representative liberal democracy as a method, not as a way of life, as a method of competing for the people's vote to select political elites. In Schumpeter's account, the political leaders are not supposed to give effect to the will of the people, but, on the contrary, are able to fashion or even create the people's will, which eventually is, in his own word, quotation, not a genuine, but a manufactured will. A manufactured will shaped not by rational persuasion, but by appeals to prejudice and passion. Holding that common good and rational citizenship are fake flagships with no empirical substance, the manufactured will is no longer outside his theory of democracy as method. Instead, quotations, manufactured will enters on the ground floor as it should. End of quotation. Amidst the Second World War, Joseph Schumpeter expressed a kind of pessimist realism, as I take it. His notion of manufactured will, quite like Walter Lippmann's account of propaganda as manufacture of consent, does not stand that far away from what Sheldon Wallin's more recent concept of managed democracy. For Wallin, managed democracy is the application of managerial skills to the basic democratic political institution of popular elections, leveraged by the symbiosis between big business and the superpower. Consequently, democracy increasingly changes into some non- or anti-democratic system, superseding the voice and the demands of the many, in the sense that it does not address inequalities and turns anti-democratic components into integral, rather than aberrant elements. Wallin describes this system as inverted totalitarianism, and is roughly the same idea with what is called post-democracy, competitive authoritarianism, and phantom democracy. Exemplary cases are post-communist countries like Russia, Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria, Poland, Belarus, Montenegro, and Kazakhstan. Big countries as well, like India, Brazil, and Turkey, and many established democracies like the USA. For all indicators recorded in VDEM, in the World Value Survey, the Economist Intelligence Unit, and so on, and of course the Freedom House, it might be too much to claim that we are facing a third wave of autocratization. But at any rate, contemporary democracy, this cannot be denied, in different time zones faces authoritarian risks and challenges. Recently, in a gloomy manner, John Keane described this state of affairs as new despotism, and held that within states known as democracies, rot and decay have the upper hand. "45 years ago, the immanent Greek Marxist Nikos Poulantzas had commented upon these challenges and the degradation of democracy in advanced capitalist countries, referring to what he called authoritarian statism. This has been expressed by the decline of the parliament and the ever-growing weight of the executive and the person on the top of the executive over other state institutions such as parties, deputies, and the judiciary. This in turn affects legitimation processes which depend increasingly on plebiscitary practices and media manipulation, signs of a cascading legitimation crisis of late capitalist state to which Habermas referred to a few years prior to Poulantzas. The increasing distrust and mistrust towards political institutions and political personnel experienced in almost all Western societies over the last 30 years or so are worrying symptoms of this trend. It is not accidental that a substantial bulk of literature on social and political trust has been produced over the same period. Nowadays, for instance, authoritarian statism is stunningly conveyed in Hungary. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has repeatedly and proudly declared that his country is an illiberal democracy, deflecting, therefore, from the standards of EU democracy, which 30 years ago, however, he thought were the future of his country. Quite on the contrary, recently he declared that today we believe that we are Europe's future. The fact that he was recently elected for the 4th consecutive time is a clear indication of the thin roots of democratic values in this country. That Marine Le Pen took 41.5% of the vote in the second round of parliamentary elections last April is another trend of authoritarian statism and of the rise of competitive authoritarianism in the center of Europe, and a striking sign of how democracies may die out. Let alone, of course, that Front National secured 89 seats in the first parliament very recently, last June. This is another example. But still, another example from the other side of the Atlantic, according to Stacey Abrams, in the USA, 600 bills undermining minority votes and voices are moving through 48 states, pointing to the oppression of those who struggle most to be heard. These institutional mutations of democracy are related with the differential distribution of authoritarian and liberal views of democracy alongside the left-right axis in various countries, as documented in different measurements. To be sure, however, the erosion of democracy is not just a matter of values. Values cannot give us an adequate answer as to why there are democracies without democrats. That is to say, masses of citizens who support the dislike of liberal values. And here comes the second challenge. The discrepancy between political and socioeconomic equality. That nowadays, within country income and wealth inequality is growing at fast pace goes as a truism. That the richest 10% of the global population currently take 52% of the global income, whereas the poorest half of the population earns 8.5 is of course a common wisdom. It is not accidental that in the last World Economic Forum report on inequality, it is emphasized that the income inequality between the world's richest and poorest is growing, and that addressing the challenges of the 21st century will not be feasible without significant redistribution of wealth. By and large, then, democracy is not delivering the appropriate policies to address socioeconomic inequalities as well as multiple and intersectional discriminations. Millions of people around the globe are experiencing a gap between formal citizenship rights and their actual efficacy, as long as they do not participate in the national consumer way of life and have no adequate access to common goods, public services, and the labor market. Apparently, and within the context of global acceleration, this makes for the coupling of an accountability gap and an expectations gap, as well as for a grid of unequal distribution of life chances and class positions, and it is a pertinent source of systemic and felt injustices which fuel grievance politics. Even if they are not the only driver, socioeconomic inequalities in many countries are closely connected with the polarization of the political scene, as well as with the affective polarization of the public sphere, and with the emergence of new cleavages, where the identity and the will formation processes are marked by negative emotionality. For very many relegated individuals, the disappointing gap between formal citizenship rights and their actual enactment referred to before is experienced in various degrees, either in isolation or collectively. Hence, the repeatedly documented discontent and disillusionment with the political status quo, distrust, anger, as well as hopelessness, low internal and external efficacy, victimization, political apathy, and alienation. No surprise then that the abstention in the second round of the parliamentary elections in France was over 53%. There is evidence that anger is closely related to social movement activity, populist mobilization, and preference for backlash political parties. There is also evidence that felt injustice and victimization, based on the gap I referred to before, between the perceived equality of the rights that emanate from formal citizenship and the real power to enjoy them, When combined with low political efficacy and a sense of destiny, leads to an emotional reaction, leads to an emotion known as ressentiment, to which Teresa yesterday referred to extensively. Elicited from reaction formation defense mechanism, as well as from negation and disavowal, ressentiment can be characterized as a psychological dynamite for democracy, since it incubates. To my mind, it doesn't lead directly, but incubates left-wing and left-leaning extremism, Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, Trumpism, and what Ronald Inglehart described as silent revolution in reverse. The way I understand ressentiment is written there, to my mind, is an unpleasant, complex moral emotion with no specific adversaries, experienced by relegated individuals, including a chronic relieving of repressed and endless vengeance, hostility, hatred, envy, schadenfreude, and resentment due to the powerlessness of the subject in expressing them, and resulting at the level of moral values in the disavowal of what is unconsciously desired. The socioeconomic inequalities coupled with a neoliberal individualist ethos are likely to make for a context of social comparison which systematically leads to frustration and cynicism, which goes beyond mere skepticism or even distrust for power institutions and state officials. Of course, a sort of skepticism is necessary for vigilant democrats to keep the powerful accountable. But cynicism, and political cynicism for that matter, is something different from skepticism, and certainly it's not reduced to distrust. In my opinion, it is a multifaceted emotional climate composed, among others, of sarcasm, irony, mocking, nihilism, bad faith, aloofness, resignation, indignation, fatalism, hopelessness, and powerlessness. Cynicism results into an as-if political attitude, which renders democratic processes highly ostensible. Despite all the distrust towards ideologies, despite all denouncement of traditional ideologies and, of course, the great narratives, to a great extent, people continue to act as if they believe them, looking, as it were, for the lost forever religious and all-embracing secular credos, and also looking for functional equivalents of faith. Even if people do not take ideological proportion seriously, even if they keep an ironical distance, they are still putting them into effect in an ultimate meaning-making effort to persuade themselves and others that they believe that they believe. In this respect, cynicism becomes a form of what Jeffrey Goldthwait called legitimation through disbelief, promoting a sort of self-perpetuated, ostensible democracy to the extent that the electorate and the power incumbents act as if they all believe in the values, norms, and rules of democracy, while evading or despise them in reality. Let me now come to the third challenge of democracy, which is the crisis of public knowledge and public communication. Due to the proliferation of echo chambers and filter bubbles resulting from the decline of traditional news outlets and the spread of online information, a sort of infodemic has come to the fore, which is replete of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and of course conspiratorial myths. Many people around the world are baffled, really baffled, about what exactly is truth with respect to political debates and the public sphere. Apart from socioeconomic inequalities and status anxiety, increasing political polarization in many Western societies counts both as a cause and effect of the spread of fake news. It is not irrelevant that post-truth has become such a popular catchphrase in the political discourse. It seems that an incremental process of propagandization of news and newsification of propaganda is taking place, mutating the terms of the democratic public communication. Provided that fake news travels through the social media 6 times faster than accurate stories, it tends to create an informational ecosystem where the breakdown of trusted information sources becomes the rule, becomes the standard reality. This is a major, of course, challenge to the democratic public sphere, with the question being whether the post-truth phenomenon, and especially fake news, will be curtailed over the next 10 years or so through a national or transnational regulation mechanisms, news media self-regulation, media literacy programs, and of course, fact-checking initiatives. And to stress the point further, social grievances, political polarization, widespread cynicism, moral relativism, the intensifying commercialization of news media seized by infotainment, the mediatization of politics, and the concomitant politainment make up a perfect storm to trigger the crisis of public knowledge. This crisis not only contains a plethora of fake news and discourses about alternative truths, but is conducive to nativism, angry populism, and anti-politics. Undermining the very idea of public interest and the sense of a political cultural common ground, it directly erodes Republican values and democratic citizenship. And of course, this is associated with the rise and spread of the so-called information and communicative capitalism, the platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism based on dataveillance and the datification of society. Through mass surveillance of data on health, on contacts, on immunity certificates, and the mass storage of such data, mainly by GAFAM, new modalities of subjection and subjectivation are created, come to the fore. Especially in the cases of electoral choice, affinity profiling violates privacy, providing online platforms with sensitive information such as ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. In the cases of surveillance advertising, personal data are treated as commercially exchanged human bonds. As once bureaucracy was for Weber the iron cage of modernity, for Zuboff, surveillance capitalism is the iron cage of our contemporary digital era, where in practice GAFAM have pressed on an anti-democratic coup d'etat. This accumulation of power happens because so far liberal democracies worldwide have been incapable or unwilling to put forward a consistent vision and model of democratic governance for the 21st century that considers the usurpation of digital communications by market forces. A serious repercussion of surveillance capitalism is the privacy paradox, namely a dichotomy between individuals' willingness to concede their data with almost negligible rewards and their expressed concerns about the violation of their privacy. This is a much debated issue among digital scholars engaging new forms of subjectivation in the digital era. Challenge number 4. New World War confrontation. As far as security and patterns of violence are concerned, the globalized risk environment that we already live has been deteriorated by an ever closer overlapping of and intertwining of natural disasters, disease, poverty, climate change, and wars. Contemporary conflicts have been characterized as new wars. in the sense that political violence is more omnipresent, more directed at civilians, and the distance between war activities and criminal activities is blurred, and that zones of peace and zones of war exist side by side. On top of that, information warfare and psychological operations through the proliferation of fake news create a self-perpetuating emotional climate of threat in many corners of this world. This is an anxiety of unease, facilitated and amplified by internet connectivity and interoperability. The first generation of internet scholars were optimistic regarding the capability of the internet to bring together people all over the world, to promote dialogue and boost democracy. We know, of course, by now that things are not that bright. The internet facilitated and generated hate speech, encouraged Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, fueled nationalisms and the formation of moral tribes, enhanced cultural fragmentation, and contributed to the cacophony of the public sphere. In other words, for all it's worth, certain uses of the internet and the cyberspace are detrimental to democracy and peaceful global coexistence. As long as Mark Leonard's claim that we live in an era of unpeace is valid, corroborated therefore Ulrich Beck's notion of global risk society, and as long as the war in Ukraine is going to last and spill over to other regions, the likelihood is that insecurity and anxiety will grow steadfast, with more people adulating strong leaders and demagogues, lingering to what is called political tribalism. This happens because in stringent and threatening times, citizens show a need for rigid, predictable rules in their search for stability and belonging, and security, of course. These trends have been repeatedly documented in various measurements, international measurements, in World Value Survey, in Pew Global Attitude Survey, and so on. Under these terms, authoritarian reflexes and the deterioration of democratic arrangements are likely to augment in consolidated democracies, as well as in countries of the third wave of democratization. In the countries of competitive authoritarianism, for large parts of the public, the hate for democracy is bound to increase and produce sources and causes of interethnic and intrastate tension and conflicts. In less developed countries, the new wars are likely to push further failed statehood and upcoming anarchy. Let me now turn and comment on some paradoxes of democracy. From the 19th century onwards, modern democracy is instituted in class societies by the dynamic articulation of freedom and equality, which permeates the history of political modernity in the sense that modern democracy draws from two different traditions. The liberal tradition premised on the rule of law, human rights, constitutionalism, and individual liberties on the one hand, and the democratic tradition which prioritizes equality, identity between the rulers and the ruled, and popular sovereignty on the other. Macpherson, Chantal Mouffe are prominent scholars commenting on this paradox. The coexistence and the articulation of these two constitutive traditions of liberal democracy have never been soothing, have never been settled once and for all. There are always very varying tensions and circumstantial oscillation between the two traditions in different political cultures and political scenes. For Chantal Mouffe, they do not just generate unavoidable frictions in political arrangements. They bring about what she calls the democratic paradox, the establishment, that is to say, of limits to popular sovereignty in the name of liberty. As this paradox is never solved, It generates different versions and mixes of democratic arrangements alongside the dynamics of political antagonism. Elite vis-à-vis participatory democracy, instrumental procedural vis-à-vis value-oriented democracy, representative vis-à-vis direct democracy, liberal vis-à-vis civic republican democracy, and so on. Drawing from longitudinal data from the World Value Survey, Christian Welzer and others have pointed to another paradox of democracy, in the sense that extensive support for democracy may coexist with severe deficiencies in the latter, including its complete absence. This is demonstrated in countries like China, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Belarus, Singapore, Qatar, and Uzbekistan, where in different rounds of the World Value Survey, the support for democracy is over 70%, while autocracy blossoms. Nothing disturbs the authoritarian regimes there. They argue, I mean, Christian Welzer and his colleagues, they argue that this is not a signal of regime delegitimation, but it is a symptom of a non-liberal, actually authoritarian understanding, authoritarian perception of democracy. Lingering to illiberal and non-emancipative values and cultural patterns, that is to say, preference for strong leaders, tolerance for army rule, prevalence of experts in decision-making vis-à-vis the government, respondents' attitudes in these countries testify to an incongruence between their desire for democracy and values conducive to democracy. Hence, through the disjunction of democratic mass preferences from emancipative values, pressure for democratization is weakened even more and can provide even an indirect legitimation of the regime, of the authoritarian regime itself. Another paradox I would like to refer to comes from a tripling of the citizen in neoliberal functional financial capitalism, which is likely to bring forth a threefold emotional ambiguity. As a producer or employee, she expects, asks, or demands higher wage or salary, as well as better public services and social security. As a consumer, she requires lower prices for goods and services. As a shareholder or a rentier, she expects higher return on equities. In principles, these are three incompatible vectors stemming from the individual's antinomic position into the national and transnational grid on financial capitalism. For instance, lower prices mean lower salaries, or even lowering the value of equities. Yet, high salaries follow from low return on equities, and so on. These mutually exclusive opposites are likely to elicit incongruent emotions like hope versus disappointment, content versus anger, sadness versus joy, fear versus gratitude, and so on. Now I'm getting into the last part of my speech, and let's comment on the appraisal of the situation. And thus, so far I discussed these challenges and paradoxes which punctuate contemporary democracies in different time zones, which render democracy an open-ended political project, wavering between democratization and de-democratization tendencies. At any rate, fragility and instability, as I said in the beginning of my talk, are inherent in the very constitution of democratic regimes. Since early 2000, in different proportions and multiple rhythms in various countries, several shattering occurrences at events like terrorist attacks, immigration flows, fake news, the war in Ukraine, as well as concurrent crises such as the 2008 financial breakdown, climate change, the pandemic, and the energy crisis right now have disrupted and are disrupting the satisfaction of many people's needs for security, stability, and belonging. It seems that the neoliberal democratic system is at pains to fulfill its premises regarding the satisfaction of the electorate's needs, demands, and preferences. Hence, the legitimacy deficit and the political representation crisis and the ascendance of authoritarianism and backlash politics. Nevertheless, in an optimistic spirit, I don't ultimately buy the argument that we live in the zeitgeist of the deterioration of democracy. Maybe I'm too optimistic in this. Democratization and de-democratization tendencies coexist, and that heterodox potentialities may be given, and heterodox potentialities may give rise to a left-leaning heir of modernity like Habermas or Wallen would claim that the recovery of democracy, the bringing back of democracy, or the return of the political is not an utopian gesture counter to the political dynamics of our times, where inequalities are often taken for granted. It is, however, a historical and political and cultural bet. It is true. Yes, it is true that democracies are transformable regimes, but nothing guarantees their fate. The holding, therefore, of the deconsolidation of democracy and the rectification of anti-political malaise are contingent upon prerequisites which would, on the one hand, undermine polarization and the concomitant zero-sum conceptualization of politics, as well as the technocratic and managerial understanding of democratic arrangements on the other. Of utmost importance is not only the lowering of the wealth disparities, the redistribution of money and the reparative and distributive justice procedures, but also it is of importance the redistribution of esteem, through policies facilitating equal start rather than open roads for everyone. Which means that bringing democracy back in is premised on providing not only equal opportunities, but also equal conditions to the less privileged citizens, so that reactionary anti-politics to wither away in favor of more constructive and participatory politics. At the beginning of my talk, I referred to the idea that democracy in modernity and late modernity, for that matter, is centered on a void. This draws from Claude Lefort, who convincingly argued that the collapse of the ancien regime overthrew theological and monarchical certainties, as well as any a priori organic unity of the political organization of society. In his words, quotation, "the locus of power becomes an empty place," end of quotation, which means that the anti-monarchical revolutions rendered democracy a fundamentally indeterminate process of political antagonism, where the last word cannot and should not be uttered. This empty locus is ultimately the taboo of democracy. No one is entitled to occupy or fulfill it once and for all. What is at stake here is the open and dislocatory character of the political, premised on social division, contradictions, and contention. Democracy is not resting on a pre-given common good. Instead, it provides the institutional space for citizens to dispute and doubt the very idea of common good. But it does not permit them to doubt the right of everyone to doubt. This is not an infinite regression. It is rather the quintessential of democracy that rests on the interplay between unity and difference. That is why democracy disappoints those who seek final answers, since it dissolves the fantasies of fullness. To put it differently, the kernel of democracy is the lack of completeness. Psychoanalytically speaking, it rests on a symbolic castration where the subjects resign from imaginary wishes for omnipotence and fullness. Saying that, please do not take me wrong. I by no means endorse the Church's famous quote that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. By evoking Therefore, I just wanted to say that as Democrats, we have to rapport with ambivalence, ambiguity, and undecidability, which means that democracy is institutionally premised on public deliberation and emotional reflexivity under conditions of openness, transformability, and uncertainty. It is a deep-going and ever-present precarious equilibrium of thought, will, feeling, and action. Alongside the process of social comparison, emotional reflexivity is premised on the citizens working through of their sentiments within an emotional public sphere and a parliament of feelings. In this respect, responsible Democrats are called upon to be assertive in demanding equity, solidarity, and dignity, but to do so in a manner that it is not envious, or even worse, in a manner which is not resentmentful. I know that here I am keeping a distance from Tocqueville, who argued that envy is the emotional underpinning of democratic equality. In this respect, perhaps we can get an intellectual lesson from the Athenian democracy. Almost a kilometer away from here, from this venue, on Pnyx, in his notorious epitaph delivered in 430 BC in praise of democracy, Pericles proclaimed that the freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. There, far from exercising a jealous surveillance over each other, we do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing what he likes, or even to indulge in those injurious looks which cannot fail to be offensive, although they inflict no positive penalty. By all this ease in our private relations does not make us lawless as citizens. Against this fear is our chief safeguard, teaching us to obey the magistrates and the laws, particularly such as regard the protection of the injured, whether they are actually on the statute book or belong to that code which, although unwritten, yet cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. Under this spirit, emotional reflexivity as a progressive emotional driver of democracy is to be differentiated from the faddy postmodern democracy or democratic politics, namely the affective style of anything goes, wherein what counts is the spontaneous, authentic, so to say, political emotional outcry of the public. This calls forth a distinction between democratic emotionality and demagogic emotional manipulation, that is to say, propaganda, which is easier, of course, to say than to do. The constitutive emotional regime of democracy requires delicate feeling rules, facilitating the combination of closeness and distance, phronesis and pathos, toleration and solidarity, rules and norms, in other words, that enable the mediations between engaging public deliberation, political equality, and positive as well as negative freedom. These rules are difficult to abide by, as they entail recurring self-monitoring of political action and cultivation of Republican virtues such as toleration, humility, dignity of work, solidarity, and justice, which come at odds with the neoliberal entrepreneurial outlook of the self. In this regard, Wendy Brown and Revaud alone are succinctly right when they claim that democracy is the regime that we do not love, albeit we cannot but want it. The regime that we do not love, albeit we cannot but want it. Jeffrey Alexander's prayer for a constitution of a civil sphere to sustain democracy, not just as a form of government, but as a mode of associated living experience, based on justice and solidarity, is equally timely. It is timely because it points to the difficult mediation between individualism and collectivism, to avoid particularistic dissociation and state repression, while at the same time attaining to couple brotherhood and otherhood. This mediation is part and parcel of what Albrecht Wellmer described as demokratische Sittlichkeit, democratic societal ethos. In Hegelian terms, this amounts to a sort of reasoned public freedom premised on the interplay of individual and institutional reflexivity. It is premised on cognizant negotiation and distance from the narcissism of small differences, lifestyles and traditions on the one hand, and deliberation, social inclusion, distributive justice, and immanent critique of any possible normative project concerning the societal terms of opinion and will formation processes. That is why democracy is an unease and unceasing political, cultural, and moral emotional achievement. Thank you very much.